Now we are going to get started. Everybody settled? We're good? Okay. So before I start, I'm going to tell you a brief little story for those of you who were here last week when I was speaking about non-human animals. I read an article in the Cornell Ornithology magazine. I'm a member there. And one of the articles was about a bird species, a starling. And these starlings, amazingly, do something that has only been observed over 20 years of study. Scientists take a while, and we have to give them that time. And what they are doing is unusual. Scientists have noted that there are times when inside a family of birds, people will be taking care of the newest generation. So a previous generation of chicks will grow up and help mom and dad take care of the next generation. Isn't that sweet? But in this particular group of birds, that happens among friends. So say you and I are a very close friend. You are bird A and I am bird B, Barbara. So Fran has her chicks in year 2025, and my job as her friend is to bring over food for her chicks. And I have my chicks in 2026, and Fran's job is to take care of mine. So what they've discovered is that birds create friendships that are not based on family relationships that help them take care of the new generation. And we thought we were so sophisticated? All right, today's topic, we're going to be looking at emotions and the divine body. And I'm going to do a little bit of review at the start. Some of you may have seen one or two of these slides before, but I'm going to start with asking us to think about the things we were told. Now, this was particularly true when I grew up. What I was told of the God in my Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, as scholars call it, because it was written in Hebrew. And I was told that the biblical God had certain characteristics. And we're going to first take a look at that piece, and then we're going to take a look at putting this biblical God in context, because this God has contemporaries, right? There are other gods in the ancient world that exist alongside that God. I just got a really interesting look from Beth, who just went, what? Well, you know, this God has contemporaries even in the Bible. This God has other gods who appear in this Bible. Chemosh and Dagon and various other deities also show up in the text. So we know that this God is actually not alone, despite what we were told in Sunday school. And then we're going to ask, what happens when we look at these texts and we ask, how does this God express emotions? So what we've been told, that's our starting point, right? What we have been told is that ancient deities were kind of like human beings, only larger, right? Zeus is a really big dude and a really violent dude. So we've been told that, but we've also been told that the Israelite was different. This God was different than other gods, right? He didn't have a wife. He didn't play around with, you know, human women. He was transcendent, non-corporeal, on high, right? Mysterious. This should all sound familiar to you because you've heard these things about God too, right? That this is the thing that makes this deity distinct from the deities around his time and around the time that his authors are writing about him. We are also told that no image could be made to represent God, and that's proof of this God not having a body, right? This is a transcendent God. You can't make an image of him that would be reducing him, anthropomorphizing him. Is this all sounding like sort of familiar, right? And we have also been told that the Israelites invented monotheism. And I'm here to tell you that just about every one of the things that are on here has its problems, because the ancient world is a whole lot more complicated and sophisticated and also predictable than we would think. So we're going to just start with, how do we take a look at this deity in his context? And you know what? The Israelites weren't the first to imagine a God that wasn't visible. We think they were, but they were not. Ancient cultures also envisioned this invisible God, and you could see in ancient Babylonian, Sumerian texts that we have deities often referred to with just a symbol, right? They can just have a symbol. We have one right there, the symbol there, that half sickle there, that crescent that you see, that is hanging sort of in the sky above the picture of the king, and various, officials and bureaucrats who are coming before him. Deities can be represented through a symbol. Sometimes they are represented, get this, through an empty throne. Just the chair is there, but you don't see a figure of the deity. Does that sound like no picture can be made of me, right? That can be there too. So before we start with, the ancient Israelites invented this idea that there's an invisible, transcendent God. No, this invisible and transcendent beings were around. One of the things I often tell my students at UNC Charlotte is that human beings really haven't created a whole lot of new ideas about the divine since they started thinking about the divine. And that may be because we all need both the God who speaks to us and who is with us and whose presence we feel, and we all need the God who is that mysterium dweller, right? Who is transcendent and beyond our comprehension. Those might just be among the human needs that have generated ideas around the deity that are not new, that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and we can see them in these cultures. I mentioned a symbol. This particular one, the Sumerian one, is a sign for God or goddess. And so when you read a text and you come along this little kind of star-like sign, what does that sign represent? Either a god or a goddess. It represents divinity. It's just a sign. It's not a name. It's not a word in its way. It's just a sign for the divine. So, I thought I'd also give you a text just to kind of put our deity in context. How manifold it is what thou hast made. They are hidden from the face of man. O sole God, like whom there is no other. Thou didst create the world according to thy desire, whilst thou were alone, all men, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth going upon its feet, and what is on high, flying with its wings. Where is this text from? Genesis, question mark? Okay, big question mark. Any other ideas where this text might be from? It's clearly looking familiar to you in some way. What are the ideas in it that look familiar to you? What are just some of the ideas that look familiar? A sole God, right? A God who creates everything, whatever is on high or whatever creeps on earth. I think the reason Reagan is thinking about Genesis is that at the very beginning, God creates the creeping things and also the flying things, right? This is the great hymn of Aten from 14th century BCE. It's an Egyptian text. And you should know that that hymn bears a notable resemblance to Psalm 104. In fact, some scholars have said Psalm 104 is copying this text. And we actually have places where we can see and have seen and are able to demonstrate when biblical texts are redeploying texts that were used in Egyptian settings, but particularly in Canaanite settings. You'd be surprised how many times things are ascribed to David that look a lot like they were the work of Enheduanna, high priestess of Inanna, a Sumerian writer. Some of our biblical texts look like they are modern versions, so to speak, of her work. So a little humility might be called for when we think about what we imagine is a unique contribution, and I'm saying this, right, as a rabbi in front of you. Let's take a look now a little bit at God's body and God's emotions. So we have texts here that specifically speak to an emotional life. My sorrow is beyond healing. My heart, libi, my heart, is sick within me. Now, the heart in Hebrew Bible is a complicated organ because it's not the brain that is the seat of emotions and thought and all these things necessarily. The seat of thought is also understood to be in the heart. So God's thinking, as well as, and sometimes the heart is also used as a term that implies kind of an emotional setting in an organ. So both God's thinking and God's emotions are being expressed here. And this famous text from Genesis, when the deity is sorry, regrets that he made humankind on this earth and it grieved him again to his heart. He's both thinking about it and feeling it, feeling the pain, as we would say. I don't know if you've ever had the question in your mind, was humankind a mistake? Sometimes studying human history, it certainly has occurred to me. And this is a deity who questions himself, right? And wonders, did I do the right thing? There's a lot of emotional valence behind questioning yourself, isn't there? That's an emotional thing to do. To ask yourself, did I do the right thing here? Or should I tell Abraham? Or should I hide from Abraham? Right? Those are not just intellectual questions. Those are emotional questions, too. Have you ever thought about hiding something from someone you love? It probably wasn't just an intellectual exercise. So, one of the reasons for these pictures is that emotion expressed and felt in our faces, in our bodies, is hardly an ancient concept alone. How many of you know the book, The Body Keeps the Score? Right. And in this book, a psychologist speaks to the way in which our body remembers trauma. Our body keeps the score. Sometimes we know that a human being doesn't specifically remember a thing that's happened to them, but the body does, because they can be triggered by things that are familiar, and then the body will react with panic, with fight, with flight instincts. Right? So keep this in mind, that we have already in our conceptual universe a sense that our bodies express emotions. Just looking at when Beth made that interesting face, right? Or when Reagan had that question in his face, is that Genesis? Right? I saw a bunch of thinking faces that also were expressing some emotion around what they were thinking, right? When you smile back at me, you're saying something about the way in which we are feeling together, the humor of the moment, right? So our bodies send signals all the time of what we are feeling, all the time. One of the ways in which this deity shows emotions is through his nose. The nose knows. What happens, the deity in these texts has quite a wide nose, a long nose, and the Hebrew is really quite specific. The nostrils kind of flare and smoke comes out. We should imagine this in some kind of film. That would be like, you know. And the force of the wind from the nose would knock everybody down, right? That's how we would be operating here. So what happens? The blast of the breath of his nostrils, this deity is roaring. This deity is expressing an emotion that is pretty darn intense. The breath of God's nostrils can kill. So don't get this God angry, because he can blow his rage from his face into the world. All of a sudden, God has a face, right? And a nose like human beings. So we want to be thinking about the way in which this God is no longer representing a non-corporeal presence. This God has a body. I spent an entire semester last spring teaching a course called God's Bod. We went through all of God's body parts. It was quite interesting. We're not going to do that today. It would take too long. I mean, 16 weeks and, 30 minutes. So what do we see? The Hebrew Bible describes this deity panting and gasping and blowing and smelling and snorting. These are all very physical activities. What is very interesting is that false gods can't do that. Ooh, that's something to think about. False gods cannot do bodily things because false gods aren't real gods. Real gods have bodies, and real gods do things with their bodies. Did I just turn some things upside down for you? Right? It's so interesting how our liturgies and our prayers and our Sunday schools choose text A, B, and C, but ignore D, E, and F. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah, because it's complicated. Now, personally, I think that complication is exciting and wonderful, right? It opens up new doors for us. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask you, what is the spiritual meaning of everything I am telling you? What kind of spiritual lesson can we take from this? There are some, I promise. So, another piece. Now, we're going to revisit this question because there have been plenty of scholars over the last 40 years who have, with real intention, tried to take texts like these and say, oh, God has a feminine side. Remember what I said last week? We're going to revisit this next time I'm here in early November. Is there a feminine God? What's happening here, though, is that God is not described as being a woman, but as doing things like a female does. In other words, making those same kinds of absolutely raw sounds from the gut sounds a woman in labor makes. Now, without getting too personal about this, I can tell you that if anybody had told me the kinds of sounds I was going to make birthing a 9-pound, 6-ounce baby, I would not have believed them. And I can also tell you that they were not controlled. I couldn't control them. The body took over. It made its own noises, right? And those noises were not, quiet noises. And those noises were raw noises, and they came from the gut. I want to speak to you for a moment about the kinds of noise that is not controllable. After my husband had to have open heart surgery after he literally walked, well, not literally walked, but essentially walked up to the door of death and turned around and came back with the help of brilliant surgeons at Northeast Medical, was within 72 hours of death when he was admitted to the emergency room. He had heart failure, he had wasting disease, he had malnutrition. About 2 weeks after that surgery, when he was home, I had the job of wrapping up a huge white net that was, in those days, I created tents over my monarch caterpillars to protect them from predators. And this thing was huge. It was, imagine from here to the end of that room, I had staked it over a bunch of milkweed plants. And it was windy. And I couldn't get control over this long white sheet. I just kept winding up in front of me. And I finally sat down on the grass and thought, okay, just can't do it. You just bunch it all up and figure out how to do it later. And I walked into the house. My husband and our son were in the library. And I walked into the back room to go wash up. And I suddenly realized why I could not do that job. Because my husband wasn't helping me. Because there weren't two of us to wrap this up, as in years before. And everything that had happened in the previous weeks around his health collapsed in on me, and I started making the most raw, uncontrollable, sobbing would not really describe what I was doing, because these were noises of the horror and the fear and the pain that were all coming out at the same time. Our bodies will not only express our emotions, sometimes they will remind us that they are in control, right? And I think that's what this kind of text is. God is in the rawest state that the writers can think of, a state that has little to do with the mind and everything to do with the body, and that is giving birth. Emotions are organic. This also happens with other deities, right? Excitement and lust and distress, all of these things are located in inward parts for other ancient deities. A knot of Ugarit tramples her enemies. By the way, I'm afraid there are texts just like this for the deity of the Hebrew Bible. And by the way, also texts like this in Revelation, where Jesus ends up with blood up to his knees. So our Bibles have texts like this elsewhere, where the deity tramples enemies and enjoys it in their hearts and in their livers. Or, the liver is kind of a thing in the ancient world, right? It comes up a lot as the seat of tremendous amounts of emotion. And we can see here God in pain. What is going on? These are the intestines. These are the bowels that the Hebrew is speaking of. My anguish, I writhe in pain. The walls of my heart murmur or roar or growl, right? Those internal organs are what are being referred to in the actual text. The translation is not really giving you a raw translation here. In this passage, we have these internal organs making a fierce noise. An absolutely fierce noise. Again, a God with a bod, with actual organs, just like human beings have. And of course, in this passage, God is describing the pain he's inflicting on his foolish people, but the outcome is clearly hurting God too, right? So the pain is both being inflicted and experienced and in the body. Here's another text, my innards intone like a lyre for Moab, and my innards roar, sounding like the Bible translation is what that text is going on. I've given you a somewhat more graphic translation. Like a lyre, my heart moans for Moab, and my very soul for Ki Heres. is really about the inward parts, the bowels and the belly growling, right? You don't quite get that in this text, in this translation, do you? They've prettied it up for you. But really God is saying, I would say in Yiddish, my kishkas, right? That bowel area, I feel it in my kishkas. It's a phrase that you'll sometimes hear from Ashkenazi Jews, that Yiddish word, right? Because this is where we feel it. Below the belt, in those organs, is where we feel those emotions. So thinking about God in this way, not something we often do, but here's another text, right? The yearning of your heart and your compassion, they're withheld from me. It also sounds like Bible is at work here too, because the actual text is not about the heart so much as it is about the internal organs making a noise, right? That's the red in there. These texts are inward parts, and they are roaring. Roaring. Remember God with the nose blasting? Now imagine God with the inner parts roaring. This God's a noisy God. And you have no idea how noisy this God is. I mean, really, makes incredible noise trampling around the world. I want to come back to this idea, my heart is sick within me. How many of you really can relate to that phrase? You know what it is to feel your heart being sick within you. Many of us, I think, are living right now with a battle with our bodies, because our bodies are holding sick hearts. And every day there is something to sicken our heart. I think we all know what I'm talking about. We are in distress. So what is the spiritual lesson? I wanted to spend a lot of time being able to talk with you, but I really wanted to give you this. Let me read you the quote first, and then I want to tell you about Gerald West. He's been diagnosed with lymphoma. On a theological note, I've confounded a few friends by claiming that I take the chemo as a form of sacrament. On reflection, they rather like the notion. For me, it's genuine. I pray as I receive the chemo, inviting God to participate in its healing work, invoking the many who have gone before me as a cloud of witnesses. How many of you know somebody who went as one of those cloud of witnesses? Raise your hands. Yeah. My sister had stem cell therapy and chemo and died at the age of 42. Gerald West happens to be a man who was on the forefront of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He has spent every single decade of his adult life fighting for the rights of black people in that country. He's a white guy. And he is one of the most humble and caring and extraordinarily gentle human beings I have ever had the honor of meeting. And I've only met him through Zoom. He's one of the people I interview for the book that I just published about scholars who work on violence and sexual violence in biblical texts. When I read this, I thought, he has expressed exactly that sentence that I said and placed before. The body keeps the score. God knows, because God's body is revealed as keeping the score too. Sometimes in difficult texts, where God's body turns out to be the vehicle of divine violence. Sometimes in beautiful text, where God's body is the vehicle of divine compassion and sorrow. But that these ancient writers gave us a God whose body also keeps the score is a gift to us. We have a tendency, I think, to think of ourselves as having bodies that move our heads around. But it is our bodies that will never fail to tell us the truth. Our heads may lie, but not our bodies. Thank you. Let's have a conversation maybe and see what you are thinking in response to this. I've been changing my approach so that we have plenty of time, even when services go long and the Altar Guild is here, so we've got time to talk. Is there anyone who has a reaction, a comment, a thought about the way that bodies express emotions? And I'm particularly curious for people who haven't commented last week to see if we can get some of you shyer people to step forward. Those who spoke last week, remember the rule, step forward and then step back a little bit. Let's give some room. But is there anyone who would like to say anything or respond to this issue of how our bodies keep the score in a time when I suspect that all of us are being made tenser in our bodies than we are used to? And
with my mother, as you all know, has dementia, and she's pretty out of it. But you know, my dad died in December, and then her second true love died in early January. And even though she wasn't really aware, her health really declined. You know, her dementia really took a dive during that time period, in December and January. And her body, like recurring, does that around Christmas and January. And
I would be very surprised if her body has not remembered things that may be hard for her to remember intellectually. Yeah, there's a rhythm to the year, and we associate things that way. There is no question for me that I always move towards my own birthday with the undercurrent of consciousness that I buried my sister 2 days before my birthday. And so my birthday never was the same after that. Right, there's always that kind of, there's that thing, right? And this is like decades later. Other observations about the way that bodies remember, or the gift that it might be to have a consciousness that God's body too remembers and knows what we are living through in that way?
So easy to deny. You get to a certain age and you think, oh, there's another bit fallen off by the bed in the morning. I'll have to pick it up. But yes, and rather than paying attention to it, that's a not necessarily thanking for it, but what are you trying to tell me? Sort of thing, which is hard to remember sometimes. Oh, I'm all right.
If you didn't hear the rest of it, what is the body trying to tell me? For those of you, I'm going to give this to you. You have to put it right in front of your mouth for it to work. But that's what Jeannie was saying, right? What is the body telling me when yet another thing goes wrong? What is it telling you, Jeannie?
I'm getting older than God.
Well, and it might also be telling you, all right, friends, just for a moment, I'm going to describe a letter I wrote to my son last night because I had spoken to him during the day, and he was just listing all the horrible things and tasks that he had before him. And I said to him that during a time of real distress, I was working on a gratitude practice and thinking about what I was grateful for, and I wrote to him about what came up for me, right? The love I have for my husband, who I've known for, close on 50 years now, and how that gets better all the time, and how much I love him, and how safe I feel with him, and my love for our son, and my love for friends, and my love for the world, and the monarchs, and the bees, right? And I said to him at the close of this, none of my academic stuff comes up when I'm doing gratitude practice. I don't say, oh, I'm so grateful, I've finished 3 books, and the 4th one's out in January, and there are 2 more to go. Yeah, no. None of that stuff is what I'm grateful for, because love is the thing that makes it possible for us to live in a broken world. And one of the things that I think about, Jeannie, is that when we are doing this aging, do we get the wisdom of understanding what's important
and actually look at it.
One of the things I mentioned was friends. Yes. Friends that we love, friends that love us.
Well, I find in just how my body can react to certain things. In particular, when I see my grandchildren. You know, they can be having a hard time, but I still love to see them. It is just an emotion that comes up. And on the other side of that, whenever I've gone to visit where my brothers and my parents have been buried, it's a sense of sadness that just comes in. It's the body that's doing that reaction. I can be having a really bad day, the grandkids show up and I'm smiling. So the body is kind of leading the brain at that point.
Yes, absolutely. Just pass that back and remember.
I was just thinking, you know, I work in a school, and I feel like so many of our kids have experienced traumas that they, I'm sure, don't remember and don't know why, but it affects behavior and their actions in so many ways. And then it can affect our society and generations, and just that God understands this and often asks for his mind to be changed by the petitions of people. And I don't know, I was just thinking about that God understands, God's deep understanding of those things and those processes that we don't really always know or understand. And I don't know, just how we pray. It changes how I pray for people. And I think that, you know, I like the idea that God understands that as well.
And in a very visceral, personal way. Because the texts give us a God whose heart is grieved, right? Who has pain in the body. If God has that kind of pain, you ought to be able to trust that when you say, I am in pain, there will be understanding and compassion. I think that's, you know, that boundless compassion is what we all so desperately need in any time, right? Other thoughts about the body? And about the way it speaks the truth. How many of you apologize if you start crying? Raise your hand if you've done that. Okay, I will note that particularly women raised their hands, which might mean that men aren't allowed to do that to begin with, to cry, right? Tears always tell a truth. They tell some truth. They don't lie. For those of us who have apologized for telling the truth, we might want to rethink that practice. Yeah. I love that idea that no matter how you're feeling, the grandchildren come in and it's just joy. If I should ever have any, I'll see if that happens. How are you feeling right now? Curious. There was a reaction back there, yes? Okay, feel good? Nervous? Okay. Anything else? Yes, hold on one second, I'm a-coming.
This is more of an observation than about anything else, and a question about how is it that animals can sense what we're feeling and show their emotions as well?
Oh boy. I mentioned last week, and of course Debbie Smith ran with this. I mentioned last week that my husband has been teaching about animals, non-human animals, and their language capacity for decades, long before it became sort of fashionable to think about, oh, maybe non-human animals have communication, right? Like, he was doing this decades ago and has written in his first book, it's the second book, about this. So scientists are trying to figure that out, and this is still a field that is quite new. But one of the things that we do know is that certain kinds of non-human animals smell things in human beings that help them identify emotion or illness. Dogs are particularly good, many apparently, at smelling something that our body is producing when we are in states of distress or illness, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. And of course, I mentioned that Debbie ran with this. She went home and immediately asked my husband if he would do a program on this for After Dark. And then she got a great kick out of his response, which was he could do that. From a European dude who teaches English, right? And I said, no, that's dialect for him. That's perfectly legitimate, and so that's fine. Our neighbor Bill Laughlin taught us how to talk like that years ago. Yeah, okay, so yes, these are questions that we need to ask too. In what ways, when bees communicate with each other, are they also communicating emotion and excitement? Oh, here's the flower patch we all need to get to, right? We have been, I will emphasize from last week, again, we have been so inclined to thinking of ourselves as highly superior in this regard. We got to stop that, people. We just must. If we want any chance of helping the non-human animal world survive what we have done and are doing to the planet, we have to put our arrogance aside. How many of you saw the film Babe back in the 1990s? Remember that? The pig who becomes a sheep-herding pig? Remember that? Okay, I only saw it for a first time this week. I used to tell my students I'm culturally illiterate. I don't pay attention to movies and TV. So a friend really recommended that. Yeah, I mean, it really brought home some of the things I was talking to you about. Imagining what's going on in non-human animal minds. Other thoughts? Reflections?
I wasn't here last week.
I forgive you.
Thank you. And it may have already come up in last week's discussion, but if you haven't seen the Jane Goodall Famous Last Words documentary, do yourself a favor and check that out.
I appreciate that reminder because I have had the intention of seeing that, and thank you.
So I don't have anything on animals. I can only tell you what I experienced a little over an hour ago in this place. And when a young person was doing their gratitude talk, and they were so grateful for the loving kindness of people here who accepted this person as they are, having not experienced that at home or in school. And I was overcome with tears. I mean, I couldn't prevent it because I was joyful that this person was feeling the love of God in this place with these people. That's how we feel the love of God, of course, from each other.
Amen, brother. Yes, absolutely. I did a wedding 2 weekends ago in Charlotte for two guys who just were the delight of my life for the last year. And there were unbelievably powerful moments in that wedding. There was laughter, there was tears, and by the way, they had their dog actually as part of the processional, which was kind of cute. It was the last thing to come down. And when one of them was speaking his vows, right? And I knew the story behind their story, which I alluded to a little bit in my own remarks, which is that this was a man who had a terrible time accepting who he was, and finally kind of had made a date with his soul, looked in the mirror and said, I can't live not going back to this other man because I needed him. And I said, you know, to save a life, Talmud says, is to save the world. And I think that Corey has done that for Greg, right? And